Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us. And thank you so much to the Haskins Lab for facilitating this. I am thrilled to be able to spend some time with you this afternoon. We'll spend about 15 or 20 minutes with a live presentation, and we will leave plenty of time at the end for questions. I do want to just give you the chance to jot down my email address and my social media handles, because you should absolutely feel free to contact me with follow-up, with questions, suggestions, and such. My name is Molly Ness. I am a university professor at Fordham University, where I work in teacher education, and very much interested in childhood literacy. So I'm here today to talk to you about making the most of our read aloud. So we are always told as parents and as teachers that we should be reading aloud to our children. Our focus today is how to make the most of this read aloud, not only in the content that we are reading aloud, but also in the ways in which we facilitate these read alouds. And if you're like me, you're doing a little bit more as a parent in your child's education with the current pandemic. And so I'm going to present you with some research-based strategies that can be applied immediately this afternoon. I also just want to give the overarching message that there's no right or wrong way to read aloud. But these particular strategies that I will talk about really are meant to help optimize what you are already doing. So let's start by first just exploring a little bit of the rationale and the reasons behind read alouds. I should let you know that I could spend an entire webinar just talking about all of the academic, cognitive, socio-emotional benefits of reading aloud. And so I'll just share a brief background about the reasons to read aloud, starting with the language facilitation that occurs through a read aloud. We know now through MRI examinations of young children's brains that when they listen to a parent or a caregiver read aloud, we see activation in the parts of the brain that involve semantic processing or language processing. We know that the early childhood phase is really the period where the brain is the most plastic. And so that brain development is another hugely important part of reading aloud, as well as the ability to build knowledge, and particularly background knowledge that serves as the foundation for students' comprehension down the road. We certainly can't overestimate, we can't overemphasize the socio-emotional benefits of reading, that as we try to make our children become lifelong readers, that the love of reading and the bonding that occurs in a parent or caregiver read aloud is so important. But for today, I'm going to focus the majority of our time on the literacy skills that we can activate and facilitate and build as we read aloud. So when we're talking today, I'm going to divide our time mostly into early childhood strategies and skills, and then elementary age skills. And then I'll talk about some activities and ways to facilitate read alouds that are applicable to all of our children. So let me start with our early childhood students. These are our preschoolers, our kindergartners, usually typically under about second grade. And I wanted to first explain the idea of print referencing. And print referencing is sort of an obvious but often overlooked strategy where we draw our children's attention to the print on the page and draw their explicit attention to the features in the print conventions on the page. So when we are reading aloud with a child, we know through eye tracking software that children, their eye naturally gravitates towards the pictures. And by looking at the pictures, they're missing out on a whole slew of benefits that also are on the page. But we also know that when preschoolers are given read alouds that specifically encourage them to draw their attention to the print, that they naturally start to focus on the print 20,000 times more than they previously did. So let's look at how we can facilitate print referencing as a strategy while we're doing our read alouds to explicitly draw our children's attention to print conventions and the forms of print on the page. So here you'll see a screenshot of some of my favorite children's books. The first one on the left is Marley Frazel's roller coaster. And then we've got two different page snapshots from Mo Willems. If you are like me, you have taken advantage of Mo Willems and his drawing lessons that occur online as we've all been quarantined at home. Let's take a look at some of the different print conventions that we could explicitly draw our children's attention to. So in that first roller coaster page, we can draw our kids' attention to top to bottom, reading top to bottom. Also, we can model the finger sweep, meaning when I finish the line, I sweep my finger to the next line to continue reading that second sentence. Some people can't make a sound. We also see that big red capitalized word whoosh. We could ask our children, why do you think the author and illustrator made that word look big and red and it's a different shape? When we look at Knuffle Bunny and Elephant and Piggy by Mo Willems, we see some other print conventions. We see speech bubbles, and we can start to draw our children's attention to the forms and the functions. We could show a 3-year-old this gray bubble above Piggy's head means that, this gray bubble above Elephant's head, Gerald's head, means that he's talking. I know he's talking because this is a speech bubble. We can also start pointing out different punctuation, exclamation marks, and quotation marks as we see them off on the page. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at some of those print conventions that we might model. And this is presented in developmental order, meaning we start with book handling, typically around 2.5 to 3, and then we build and get more complex and more sophisticated in the skills that we could directly draw our children's attention to. So with my very young students, I might say to them, here's the cover of the book. Watch how I open the book. Watch how I know where the author is and the illustrator is. I know to read top to bottom. I know to read left, right. Now I'm going to keep reading with this next line right here. As my children move towards pre-K and kindergarten, I might be able to draw their attention more explicitly to the words themselves. I might be able to point out short words versus longer words. I might be able to point out some of the typography. Why do you think this is in bold? Why do you think this is in capital? I might be able to point out some of the semantic structures of word bubbles and captions and all of those different things on the page. The idea being that we don't naturally gravitate to them on our own, but they hold important meaning in the text and they hold an important function of the text. And it is a way to build our children's emergent literacy skills. So how might you do this at home? Well, if you have very young children, you might simply start by pointing things out. Watch my finger as I point to each word. You might point to some of the words that we can find in the illustrations of a picture. So perhaps you're reading a spot book and there's a cookie jar and the word cookies is labeled on the jar itself. You might point that out. You might start to ask questions of them by asking your readers, where do I go next? What might this caption say? Why do you think they put this word in big print? And as your students are ready for more sophisticated skills, you might make requests of them. You might ask them to point to specific letters. You might ask them to point to specific longer words or where sentences end, or all of those different things that occur on the page. Again, this is called print referencing, and we know that children can show us a lot about their literacy environments, both at home and school, merely by the way they maneuver through a text. The more we are able to draw our students' attention to the print, the better they are prepared to be ready for emergent reading themselves. Also, with early readers, I want to encourage you to get another dose of your parenting patience and don't shy away from repeated readings. I should tell you that when my daughter, who is now a 4th grader, when she was very young, there was a certain picture book that she wanted to read time and time again. And I will admit it was not my favorite book. And I used to hide it in the back of the shelf. And when she would ask for that book, I would say, I don't know where it went. Well, now I know that those repeated readings are actually so important that the more we read a familiar text, the more likely our children are to benefit from vocabulary and comprehension. That reading a few books many times is actually more effective than reading only one or two times a book that we have encountered. And I know if you're like me, your bookshelf is a little bit narrower these days as public libraries are closed. In fact, that's actually an advantage to return to some of those familiar texts. And we do know that up to 3 read-alouds is ideal. And as your children ask for that same book over and over, you can increase their responsibility with each reading. What does that look like? Let's take a look at Wemberley Worried by Kevin Henkes. You might say to your child, after the first time we've read this book, you might remind them, we've read this book already. Can you help me remember some of the things that happen in this book? So you're doing a basic recall question. The third or fourth time, you might ask them for some inferential information. You might ask them more sophisticated ways to interact with the text. Why do you think questions, or what might happen questions? So increasing the sophistication and getting them more involved with those repeated read-alouds is a great way to revisit that familiar text and maintain your sanity as a parent reading the same book. As our kids move up in age, I'd like to encourage you to hold back the pictures for a second. And this is a strategy I don't use all the time and I don't use with every book, but there's actually a lot of benefits to children's comprehension when we don't show them the pictures. What happens by not showing them the pictures is that we encourage children to make mental images of a text on their own. It encourages children to engage with the text in a different capacity, build their attention span, and certainly builds their motivation to read. Now, I give my kids a heads up with the disclaimer of, I promise you, I'll show you the pictures because I want to avoid the situation of them flipping out and saying, we want to see the pictures. I tell them that, but I'll say to them, first, I want you to listen to the words, and as you listen, make a movie in your mind. And then we can have a conversation about what that movie looks like. So the benefit of doing this is, as you make a movie in your mind, you are relying on comprehension strategies like visualization to facilitate your understanding, and I'm increasing your engagement with the text. We've all, as adult readers, had the experience of seeing a movie, a film adaptation of a book, and saying, that's not how I envision the character in my mind. This is a great way to build that conversation with your young readers. And just a quick reminder, previously I said that children, when they look at a book, 95% of the time, they're looking at the illustration. So if we hold the illustration, we get to some richer, more cognitively advanced components. So let's try it out. Let's try it out with a picture book by Chris Van Dusen. You may recognize Chris Van Dusen's artwork from the Mercy Watson series. Let me share a brief part of a book, one of my favorite picture books, called The Circus Ship. And The Circus Ship, as you'll see in the cover, tells the true story of a ship of circus animals that hit a rock in the 1800s off the coast of Maine and sank. And all of these animals swam to a nearby island, and the circus owner came to that island to find them. I love Chris Van Dusen's work for not only because he is the illustrator, but he's also the author of these picture books, and his language is so sophisticated. So let me read a quick portion, and as I read it, I want you to practice making that picture in your mind. I am the circus owner. My ship sunk in the murk. I've come to find my animals and put them back to work. He hiked until he came to the center of the town. His face was red. He scratched his head. He stood there with a frown. Mr. Payne looked high and low, but still he could not see the 15 circus animals of his menagerie. So if I were to ask my kids, I would say, what does Mr. Payne look like? Describe him to me. What is he wearing? What does his expression look like? And by doing that, I'm encouraging them to visualize. Then I can show them the author's rendition of the picture, and we can have a conversation of how does the picture match or not match the image that you had in your mind. But just by not letting them see this picture at first, I'm already drawing out their attention span getting them to engage in a different way, and absolutely giving them a way to interact with the text. Let's switch to talking about what to do with our older readers. My first big takeaway is to read aloud from informational text. What do I mean by informational text? I'm talking about a category of nonfiction. Nonfiction texts are the overarching umbrella, with an informational text being a subset of nonfiction, a subset that tells about the natural or social world. These informational texts can be difficult to maneuver through because they don't have a beginning, middle, and end structure. They have a lot of technical vocabulary. And the benefit of informational text is that they often appeal to some of our readers who may not take interest in the narrative storybook. Here's the challenge with informational text. We don't use them in classrooms and at home nearly to the extent that we could. When we survey teachers, we find that informational texts were chosen for read alouds very infrequently, and the same is true for parents. I know when my daughter was very young, we didn't read a lot of informational texts at home. There just isn't that same snuggle up and get cozy with an informational text in the same way. Here's the quandary though, when kids get to school, they spend a majority of their time with informational text. So what are we going to do to prepare them to maneuver through that informational text? Here's how to use informational text. First, we have to recognize that informational text has an advantage in that it doesn't need to be read start to finish. I can wander around in it, meaning I can flip from the back to the front because my informational text about snakes isn't necessarily written in chronological order. So one of the things that I like to do is I like to give my kids sticky notes and let them flip through the book and identify, here are some of the pages I really want to read together. I also use informational texts to capitalize on all of those moments at home of natural curiosity. For example, the other night, my daughter and I were watching the movie Finding Nemo, and we were watching the scene where sea turtles were swimming. She said to me, "I wonder how fast sea turtles can swim." I took out a sticky note, I wrote that question down, and we put it in our parking lot. And the next time we have the chance to go to the library, or the next time we are online and have some text to look through, we can find those answers we can use informational text as a way to address the questions that we're naturally asking. Turns out that we found sea turtles can swim up to 22 miles per hour, information we certainly would not have known without that informational text. Let's talk about ideas for readers of all ages. My first takeaway is something called a think aloud, which I'll dive into a little bit more. And then my second idea is just the nuts and bolts, how frequently we should read aloud to our kids. We're looking at least 15 minutes a day for all readers. Let's spend some time talking about a think aloud. What do I mean by a think aloud? A think aloud is when a proficient reader talks through the thinking that she or he is doing during reading. They take the internal thought processes and use I statements to help kids understand exactly what they are doing as a proficient reader, with the hope that children will internalize these maneuvers and these strategies and apply to their own reading. So typically what happens as we read books to kids is we ask them questions. We ask them to make predictions, we ask them recall questions, and those questions serve a purpose to check for understanding, to make sure your child is comprehending the text, but they're not really building comprehension in the way that a think aloud is doing. A think aloud is as if I could crack open my head and show my children exactly what I'm doing to understand the text. And again, I'm using all of these different I statements. In this picture, you'll see me pointing to my head as I read aloud in front of a kindergarten class. I like to give my kids a visual cue of pointing to my head so that they know these are the thoughts I'm thinking as I read the book. And here are some examples of what I might do. I might say to them, I was confused here. I need to go back and reread something. Or maybe I want to ask a question. I want to know in this book, why did the character behave that way. Or I might model some of my inferencing, reading between the lines. I'm getting the sense here that character is feeling angry. What you'll note in all of these think alouds is the use of I language, meaning I am showing them exactly what I'm doing to be successful in a text so that they can take that same approach and try it with their own text. Again, that's a think aloud, and it's sort of a shift from asking questions as we read to kids to showing them what we as skilled readers are doing. And I'm happy to share more of the research that shows the benefits of think alouds, benefits from preschoolers all the way up to college students, benefits for poetry as well as science books, online text too. Pretty powerful things they are with these think alouds. The last takeaway I want to share is the importance of reading to kids of all ages. I wanted to point out this resource from the Scholastic Family Report, which comes out every other year and really is a fabulous downloadable resource that looks at the literacy practices that happen in our students' homes. What we found in the most recent Scholastic report is a phenomenon called the decline at 9, where we start to see that right around 3rd and 4th grade, parents stop reading aloud to their kids. And the reasons why parents stop reading aloud to kids is at this point, most parents are assuming that kids are independent readers and they're able to do reading on their own. And we also often see children starting to resist the read aloud. I'm here to encourage you today to stick with it and continue to read aloud, because that same Scholastic report actually shows kids saying, I wish my parent had not stopped reading to me. And pretty compelling reports. I'm going to encourage you to visit readaloud.org, which is a great website and has great posters, great reproducibles, great resources to encourage reading aloud for 15 minutes every day, every child, every parent. Before I open it up for questions, I wanted to just share some of my favorite resources that you can certainly take advantage of. I mentioned readaloud.org. Some of my favorite texts come from amightygirl.com. And maybe you are at home, you are podcasters. There are all sorts of wonderful podcasts about reading aloud, about children's literature, about the backstories of authors and illustrators and picture books. And I'm happy to share some of those resources as well. And then I just want to make a final plug for a relatively new book called The Enchanted Hour by Megan Cox Gurdon, who writes a gorgeous book that shows the academic, socio-emotional, cognitive benefits of reading aloud for preschoolers all the way up to senior citizens. And I am happy to share this slideshow with you if you're not getting the chance to write all these things down, and certainly feel free to email me for follow-up questions. So at this point, I'm going to stop and answer any questions you might have. I'm going to pull them out of the chat. So please, if you have questions, let me know. And I'll look forward to being able to answer them. So, one of the questions, I'm going to pull up some of these questions. One of the questions I often get, is it okay to read aloud from a tablet, a phone, or computer? So absolutely. It's always okay to read aloud in any capacity. What we do know is we see more language interaction when we read from a hard copy of a book than we see in a tablet. And what researchers are starting to hypothesize is that when we as adults use tablets or screens, we use them as a solitary device. And so we're not as cognizant of how to take what is often a solitary device and use it in an interactive way. So typically we encourage people to use more picture books to facilitate that. That being said, there absolutely is a benefit for reading aloud from a tablet, phone, or computer. Absolutely. Another question that I often get is, what do I do if my child won't sit still for a read aloud? So that brings up a couple of things. First of all, know that your child is getting the benefits of the read aloud, even if they are across the room building with blocks or playing with their dolls or what have you. I think in our minds, we all have this vision of a read aloud being this nurturing, snuggle up right before bedtime moment where it's very calm and it's very still. And that may be an ideal situation, but that doesn't have to be the only way to read aloud. Kids still benefit from read alouds if they are being active. Another thing that you might try to do is you might switch up the timing of your read aloud. So maybe it is easier for you to do a read aloud as a child is in their high chair or they are in the bathtub. I have often found that my read alouds are more successful in the beginning of the day as opposed to the end of the day. Many parents, I think, are like me, that at the end of the day, you're zapped. You don't have very much energy to make your voice sound like the characters, and you're ready to turn on the TV yourself, and you just don't have the energy. So take the time that is best for you and make that read aloud work for you. So maybe your read aloud is first thing in the morning. That's what we do in my house. My fourth grader, who wakes up obscenely early, comes into bed with me. And we read aloud then because I know I have more patience, and it's a nice snuggly moment and a good way to start our day. I'm going to continue to scroll through the questions. Please feel free. So I'm getting some questions about sharing this recording. Yes, we are working on making this something that can be shared, and we will certainly get this out to you as soon as it is possible so that you can share with other parents, you can share with other teachers. And I will say that on my website and on social media, there are lots more practical tips for reading aloud. And there are lots of videos of me modeling that think aloud that I am talking about so that you can see me thinking aloud before you try it with yourself, with your students at home. One of the questions I'm seeing now is to share some of this research. So the one resource that I believe really does a fabulous job of compiling all of this research is that book, The Enchanted Hour by Megan Cox Gurdon, and it's Gurdon. She has done a fabulous job of writing a book that is not only informative about the brain research around read alouds, but is also really a heartwarming tribute to the power of read alouds and the socio-emotional benefits. So I'm happy to share some of those resources as well, but that Megan Cox Gurdon book is my first stop in terms of knowing more about the benefits of read aloud, and I believe it actually just came out in paperback. Megan Cox Gurdon is a Washington Post writer and has really built her household and raised her 5 children through the power of read alouds, and she does a fabulous job at looking at that science. Another question that I am going to reference, particularly as we work with parents, is what about parents who are either non-readers themselves or are non-native English speakers themselves? One of the things that I often recommend is using wordless picture books. With a wordless picture book, a parent who either is anxious or insecure about their own language or reading skills, it affords that parent the way to do all of the socio-emotional benefits of a read aloud, but by just giving them a wordless picture book, they can tell the story. They can make up the story. So it's a way to involve non-readers in a literacy-based activity. So those wordless picture books, I think, are so beneficial. And we can take a wordless picture book and tell a different story every time that we read aloud. So one question I'm seeing is, how can a teacher monitor students to do those finger sweeps in small group instruction? So this, for me, is the time to pull out those big books that hopefully you were able to get a hold of before schools closed. That's the time to use. I like to use all sorts of devices. I like to use those fake witches' fingernails that we get at Halloween, or pointers, or even laser finger lights that you can buy from the dollar store to point to model that finger pointing on those big books. If you don't have big books, No problem. You can take your typical morning message and make your morning message something that is your read aloud script and model that finger pointing, even with the text that you've generated yourself. Another thing that I often recommend to parents is around the topic of fluency. So we, as so many of us who are proficient and skilled readers themselves, when we read aloud, we naturally model fluency. And what I mean by fluency is how we make our voice sound like a character. We show expression. We read with prosody and intonation. We do things like the pitch of our voice raises at the end to signify a question. So as much as we model that with reading, I want to encourage you to explicitly say to your children, what did I do to make my voice sound like the wild beast in Where the Wild Things Are? In other words, we're naturally showing our students and our children at home what we do with our voice, but by adding that extra little burst of, how did I make my voice sound? Can you explain to me how you knew from my voice that the character was angry, so that we're explicitly drawing attention to what we're doing and really pointing it out to them so that they really understand. So a question I'm seeing come up is the approach to reading aloud and thinking aloud. When teachers, is it a different thing to read aloud and think aloud as we are in the time of school closures, doing pre-recorded lessons? I think the pre-recorded lessons is a perfect time to do more of those think alouds. As you're videoing yourself, doing those read alouds, I would really encourage you to say, this time, when you listen to my read aloud, you're going to see me pointing to my finger. And every time I'm pointing to my finger, I'm talking about the thoughts that are going in my mind. And the reason, again, that I do that is because we want our students to be able to differentiate the words from the text and the thought processes. And by showing them that visual cue, I'm explaining to them all of the rich things that I'm doing in this internal thought process in my head to understand a book. And that visual cue helps them denote the difference between the words on the page and the words in my head. How can we, one of the questions I'm seeing is, how can we make read alouds interesting for students? And some students get disengaged by read alouds. Absolutely. So I tend to, in that case, I would shorten the length of my read aloud. Again, know that 15 minutes a day doesn't necessarily have to be 15 consecutive minutes. So maybe I start with a short read aloud of a poem or an article, and then over time, I get to that 15 minutes a day. So it doesn't have to be in one fell swoop, consecutive minutes. Another thing that I like to do to increase students' engagement with the text is I might ask them, especially as we are doing digital instruction now, for them to jot down something that they are thinking in their head, and that can be sort of an accountability and engagement component as we are modeling the read aloud. So I might say to them, your homework for today, or to let me know that you've listened to the read aloud, I want you to start an I statement and fill it in. And I could even give my kids sentence starters. I could give them sentence starters like, I am wondering, and they have to fill in the blank. Or I'm getting the sense that this character, and they fill in the blank. So we could give them sentence starters as a way to encourage them to start taking on the responsibility for thinking aloud. It also builds their engagement, and it's a nice concrete task for them to have to do. So another question that I'm seeing, and I may just If you're tuning in late, I'm just going to repeat this question because I think there's no harm in hearing this more than once. Is it okay to read aloud from a tablet or from a screen or what have you? Absolutely. There are nowadays, especially as we are in this pandemic and quarantined, there are amazing digital resources. So many authors and illustrators and publishers have been so generous in waiving copyright issues and getting those digital read alouds. Absolutely. I think that's hugely important, and there is that benefit. In my parent caregiver read aloud, I tend to prefer using the hard book of a read aloud, just because what we know from research is that parents and caregivers tend to have more language interaction in a read aloud with an actual book than with a digital device. Let me give a couple caveats there. So first of all, the hypothesis behind those findings is that when we as adults use iPads or iPhones or what have you, we're used to that being a solitary activity, and so we don't naturally make that transition. But that being said, if you are particularly aware of that and really thoughtful about, okay, I know I'm not used to being as rich in my language interaction with my child with this digital text, I'm going to be especially thoughtful this time. I think there's real benefit there. There are so many digital texts now. Earlier this morning, I was on epic.com, which has just a huge amount, and I think is opening up even more digital texts than I would normally have in my home because of schools being closed. So as you do those read alouds with tablets or phones or computer screens or what have you, just really be thoughtful about still doing some of those language interactions to really get the biggest benefit from your read aloud. A great question coming up about, I have many Spanish speaking families in my classroom. Or whatever language, I recommend to them reading in their native language. I absolutely agree. There is a huge benefit from kids being able to read with a parent or caregiver or family member in their native language. So absolutely, there's no rhyme or reason that every read aloud has to be in English. Again, I really like having parents who are insecure about their own language or literacy skills use wordless picture books as a way to engage with readers. It takes some of the discomfort around the lifting the words off the page and gives parents a way in. And so there's great ways to do that. And somebody else is actually pointing out, I think that wordless picture book idea is good to use even with proficient readers. Absolutely. Wordless picture books, I think, are one of those often overlooked resources that we can do so much with. I can model a wordless picture book read aloud to my child and then see my child then try that wordless picture book read aloud to their stuffed animal or the dog or what have you. And really what matters so much in these read alouds is language interaction, and the language opportunities that come from a wordless picture book are so rich and wide. We may start just with labeling things. We may then tell the story that's in the pictures of a wordless picture book. So another question that I'm seeing, I believe earlier I had answered the question, what do I do if my child is struggling to sit still? First of all, my biggest piece of advice is know that they are still getting the benefits, the language interaction, the socio-emotional, the cognitive benefits of a read aloud, even if they are jumping and playing and they're not sitting still in your lap. So stick with it. Maybe you want to choose a different time for a read aloud. So maybe it is more of a bedtime activity, or you put a bunch of Cheerios or finger foods on their high chair tray and you do a read aloud then. Or I often used to do it in the bathtub while my child would splash around. Absolutely know that the benefits are still there, even if they aren't, but also know that you can integrate your child in a more active way. So you might, as they are playing with trains or blocks across the room, you might say to them, can you come help me find something blue on this page? jump over here and help me find something blue. And then they come, they help you, and then they go back to whatever their task is. I'm getting questions about, is it okay that my child at 6 years old or what have you reads books that are typically sort of below their level? Absolutely. What we know about students reading and the best way to engage reading habits is choice, is access. And it is okay for them to reread the same book multiple times. It's okay for them to read a book that is perhaps you might consider too babyish. When my daughter was in 2nd grade, she wanted to read all of the Minecraft books, and I found myself trying to steer her towards things that maybe had a little bit more literary value. But in doing that, I had to be mindful of reading is really all about access, choice, and relevance. Access to high quality books, student choice of books, and relevant to what is there, interesting to them. And thank you to those of you who in the chat are recommending other titles to each other. Some of the resources that I like for finding really great read aloud titles, I really like A Mighty Girl and Girls Leadership. If you have young girls at home, I think some of the recommendations from them are fabulous. The resources out of readbrightly.com are fabulous for read alouds. I am very fond of a movement and a group and a website called WeNeedDiverseBooks.com, which is really trying to increase the books that we are reading in classrooms and homes to be representative of our students themselves. So We Need Diverse Books, I think, is a fabulous resource. And then the other thing that I haven't had the chance to talk too much about are just the benefits of audiobooks. The audiobook industry is booming. $6 billion right now is the last figure that I heard about the inclusion of audiobooks. In my house, we have a book going all the time. So in our morning routine, as we are getting breakfasts and packing lunch, we have an audiobook going. And my daughter will take a bath and she will have she'll have the speaker next to her. And as she's taking a bath, she's listening to an audiobook. So another great way, I think we think about audiobooks when we're exercising and we're in car trips, but the value of an audiobook going all the time is another great way for those of us who are parents and are tired and need a little bit of a break. It's huge benefits from audiobooks as well. Well, as you have additional questions, I will continue to address them. We are working on getting out the video for those of you who would like to share this with parents and caregivers and teachers and such. That will be available. My website, again, drmollyness.com, and that's Molly with a Y. Additional resources there, additional articles for parents and for teachers, some videos of me trying out Think Alouds so that you might be able to try it out with your students. I want to thank those of you who have made the time to check in today. I know it's a difficult time to be a teacher and a difficult time to be a parent. Thank you for helping make sure that kids are really becoming readers in this time and age. So I will continue to share those resources with you and look forward to continuing the conversation with you.